I would like to introduce Jason. I didn't really ask you if you wanted me to say anything, but I think a lot of people who are in this room already know who Jason is. Leave it to be, it's, I guess, a fact that he's a very busy guy and gets lots and lots of email. And so it took us a little while to get connected, but I'm so thankful that he's agreed to come and talk with us, and I'm sure we're going to learn a lot. And I'm going to be, I'm one of the people who's going to be very interested in taking one of his events, which I'm sure he's going to tell us a little bit about mountain flying. And so one of the reasons that I was so interested in having him come is because all of us who live here and fly here, if we're going anywhere out of the state, we're doing mountain flying, right? We're going to cross the Sierras to get anywhere. And without training, that can be a really dangerous thing. So I think we can all learn and get some really important pointers and takeaways from Jason. So let's welcome you and thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It's very kind of you. Thank you. All right, if you don't mind, all right? I have detailed notes, 3 lines. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's my pleasure to be here tonight, and I want to thank you all for the invitation. I'm honored to be here. And with the way my life is going recently and all the technological stuff that I do, it's a treat to be here with real pilots, real people, real faces, talking flying. So it's a bit of a treat. There's a reason I flew all the way down for this. We are going to talk about mountain flying tonight. Let me see if there's anything that I needed to get out of the way. Well, for anybody that doesn't know who I am, I'm a career flight instructor, which is not something you find very often, and certainly not something you find almost anywhere outside of the San Francisco Bay Area. So I've been teaching flying since 2002. So what is that, the last 22 years. It's what I love to do more than anything. And throughout that process, I've done other things to help support my life, my career. I've built a YouTube channel, created a ground school app for pilots that's on your iPhone or your iPad, and also led these airplane camp trips that I'm going to tell you guys about tonight, which are real live trips that we take take pilots out into the wild. There's nothing digital about it. And we do 2 trips every year. One of them is a mountain trip, the 3rd weekend of June. That one's coming right up. The second one is the Canyons of the Southwest in Monument Valley, Utah. And those started as sort of just out of passion, being a flight instructor, as Robin was saying here in this part of the world, you're going out, you're going to do mountain flying, you're going to do checkouts, and I've taught at almost every school in the Bay Area, and we were all doing that. And it kind of occurred to me that we could do this better. If we took everybody out into the mountains and we camped there, we stayed there. And instead of going to the casinos at night, which is fun, and that's what a lot of fly-out trips will do, but instead of doing that, maybe we'll learn. Maybe we'll have search and rescue people come out and lecture or have conversations like this. So they're long weekends. We go out on a Thursday night so that everybody can get to know each other, but we hit the ground running Friday morning. And you have to imagine, too, on these trips that nobody's roughing it. I say we're camping, but most of our money goes to a gourmet chef, the Sierra Nevada camp chef. So when you land your plane at the end of the day, you might be presented with a cold beer or a glass of wine and some nice hors d'oeuvres. We go in style, is how we go. But tonight I wanted to kind of give you guys the Cliff's Notes version and see if we can roll up our sleeves and learn some of the concepts that we go over out there in the mountains. That's what I'm going to talk about, whether you like it or not. Okay. So the curriculum for the weekend in a nutshell, if I could boil it all down to some very basic bullet points, we want to learn how the airplane operates at a high density altitude. That's the first thing. And when I talk about mountain flying, let's calibrate our expectations here. I'm not talking about Trent Palmer landing on a mountaintop, one way in, one way out. It's not really backcountry flying that is my expertise. I'm not a backcountry pilot. I don't do a lot of backcountry flying. It sounds fun, but that's not what I do. What we do instead is, I tell pilots, bring the airplane you always fly. Your normal airplane. If you fly a Bonanza, bring your Bonanza. If you fly a 150, bring your 150. I want to know what you're going to be flying up there, and we will show you how to operate your aircraft safely in high density altitude environments. That doesn't mean short strips. It could be Truckee Airport. It could be South Lake Tahoe. It could be Mammoth. It could be a little more challenging, Sierraville, Alpine County. But these are all reasonable airports. They're airports that you might fly to from Livermore or from the Bay Area. And what I want to know at the end of the weekend is that you can do that safely. All right, and that to do it safely, you have to understand how the aircraft operates in a high density altitude. You have to understand mountain meteorology to some extent, how weather is different in the mountains. You have to do contingency planning. We're going to talk a lot about contingency planning. And the last bit is, if you were to have a forced landing out there in the mountains, you have to know how to get found. All right? I wasn't kidding. We actually bring out the Tahoe Nordic Search and Rescue Association as one of the lectures that we do every year. And they gave us some statistics. And I know that everyone thinks this is sort of passé, it's not really required anymore. But here's a true statistic. For those aircraft that go down and do not have a flight plan filed, it takes about 72 hours to find them. GPS locator or not. Okay? 72 hours to find them. If you have a flight plan filed, it's more like 24 to 36 hours. Okay, so an extra 2 days of not being out there in the wild, okay? So that kind of thing, like have you prepared ahead of time for what you're going to encounter? And if you do have a nice, smooth, calm forced landing, because there's plenty of places, when you fly the Sierra Nevadas, you'll spend most of your afternoon looking out the window going, oh, I could put it there. I could put it over there in that meadow. You know, there's lots of little meadows with lakes all over, and you could probably execute a safe forced landing. Can you get found, right? That's the big question. And every now and again, we read those accident reports. I don't want to say how many years ago it was because time is funny for me now. Maybe 10 years ago, but there was a guy coming through from Idaho, crashed in the Desolation Wilderness area, survived the crash, but died because he didn't have any contingency plan, right? Like that kind of thing happens more often than we'd like to believe. There's a book you could read, actually. One of the instructors on our mountain trip, one of the guys that comes with us, knew this person personally. It's an old story, but it's a powerful story. She was somebody who lived in the Bay Area in San Francisco, and her friend knew a dentist, and the dentist owned a Bonanza, and they were all going to go fly to somewhere in the Owens Valley, right? Somewhere like Death Valley, something like that. And the doctor was trying to show off a little bit. He was hugging the ridgeline, and he wanted to kind of pull up and show them the beautiful, dramatic drop on the east side of the Owens Valley. Have you guys seen that? It's pretty epic. Like the whole earth just falls down, and it's a beautiful sight. He hugged the terrain a little too close. There was a downdraft, and he crashed the aircraft. Everybody survived the initial crash, but the two passengers, the pilot and the lady in the front seat, were mortally injured, and they knew they weren't going to get out of the airplane. The last thing the pilot said to the backseat passenger is, "I don't have a flight plan. We don't have a PLV. Nobody's looking for us. You gotta walk," right? So she walked by herself out of the Sierra Nevadas, right, and wrote this book called "I Alone Survived." And I read that book as a young man in Chicago, and I remember thinking, man, that's a crazy story, you know? And I come out here and I start doing these mountain flying trips, and it was because of situations like this, right? Like we could do it better. We can teach people how to operate their aircraft safely, how to expect the weather or not fly because of the weather, how to plan for contingencies, and how to get found if the worst happens while you're out there. The rewarding part is almost every year when we do these trips, somebody pulls me aside. The one guy I can remember right now was also a doctor. He owned a Bonanza A36 and lived in Marin. But he pulls me aside and says, "I think you guys saved my life this weekend." Right? And that's like, we hear that a lot. Some people think that a Bonanza, an A36, because it has 6 seats and those big doors, that you can fill everything up and go, right? You'll be shocked in the mountains. And with that aircraft, I'll never forget, there was only 3 guys on it, not particularly big guys. No, I mean, smaller than I am, around the middle, you know? And I'm 200 pounds, so they were lighter than me. There were 3 of them, and they had no bags at all. The density altitude was 8,500 feet, and they were barely getting 200 feet per minute. Barely. The owner said there's something wrong with the plane. He said, "It's never done this before. There's something wrong with the plane." Right? So our CFII said, no, this is the way it is. They had to circle climb over Truckee. Just 3 guys, no bags at all. That's a 6-seat airplane. Okay, 3 guys, no bags, 3 empty seats, 200 feet per minute up. So that's operating in a high density altitude, and you don't want your first experience with that to be what, this guy said to me on that trip was, I was about to load my wife, my kids, and my dog in this thing and fly up to Truckee until I decided to take your course, You don't want to be that person. So just as a reminder, let's dive into this stuff. We're going to kind of hit the bullets on each one of these little topics that I just mentioned so I can give you guys a condensed version of what we teach. Quick reminder on high density altitude, or for any new pilots in the room, you'll read in the textbooks that high density altitude is pressure altitude corrected for non-standard temperature. Okay, you can forget that now. Right? It doesn't mean anything, right? Density altitude is the altitude the airplane thinks it's at. It's the way the airplane will perform. If I go get in my little Cessna 150 that I commuted down here in tonight, and I climb up to 10,000 feet above Livermore, assuming it would get to 10,000 feet. But what happens up there? You guys all laugh, right? Like my engine's not putting out as much power, right? You remember the engine is just a big air pump. That's all it's doing. The cylinders are pumping air. And if the air is less dense, you're producing less power. So that is true. In a normally aspirated airplane, as you go up in altitude, you produce less and less and less and less and less power till eventually you're producing 40% or less of the power that the engine could potentially create. But that's not the only thing. The propeller doesn't have as good of a bite on the air. The wings don't have as much air to grab onto. All of this stuff is true when you're sitting on the runway in Truckee in July. Okay, it's 8,500 feet is the altitude the airplane thinks it's at. That's density altitude. It's a performance value. And we only need to know it when performance matters. You could say to me, hey, Jason, what was your density altitude flying down here from Nevada County tonight? And I would say, I don't know, and I don't care. Right? Like what altitude the airplane actually thought it was at. Maybe it wasn't 3,500, maybe it was 3,400 or 4,000. But when it matters, when you've got to get off of a piece of pavement and you've got to clear mountains and you have people on board, you really, really need to know it and you need to have encountered it. So what happens in a high density altitude when you set the power? So I'm going to try to get out of here a little bit. Okay. That's better. So what we do in the mountains, there's a couple things. And some of these things that I'm going to tell you now, you should just adopt for your flatland flying. I have, and we'll just save you all the time to figure it out. But like when we line up with for takeoff on the runway, we always have an abort point. There's a point on the runway that we've decided ahead of time. If we don't have 70% of our rotation speed by the time we pass that point, we're not going to make it, and we're not going. Okay, so I've been to mountain strips where I had to walk the runway, count the stripes, come back half, and stick a stick in the ground on the halfway point. Right, like it's critical. You've got to know where your abort point is. But then you line up for takeoff, and you stand on the brakes, and you bring power all the way in. Okay, and now you have to lean it for best power. Okay, that's intuitive in a fixed pitch propeller airplane. Okay, like my little 150. If I go full power in the 150 and I'm standing on the brakes now, don't get anxious. You're gonna, like the plane will go. So you pull the mixture back. As soon as the tachometer shows the highest indication, that's peak power. That's your best power. I can let go of the brakes and I can start rolling. But if you're flying something a little bit more complex, where you have 6 cylinders and it's a constant speed prop, usually we use the exhaust gas temperature gauges. So the EGT, and I'm not talking about those old like needle kind, but on most modern airplanes you can see 6 cylinders on some sort of digital display like a G1000 or a JPI or something like that. So let's just remember that a best power lean is something rich of the peak EGT. Okay, so quick review of lean settings. There's best power, best economy, and the manufacturer's recommended. Best power is easy in a fixed pitch prop. Lean the mixture till you get the most power. Best economy is a little less than that. It's like when you want to save a lot of fuel. You don't need a lot of power, but maybe you're going far and you want to save fuel. So that's the peak exhaust gas temperature. As hot as you can get those exhaust gases, that would be the least amount of fuel. Okay? And so when you come back in with the fuel from the peak EGT, you can find best power. So if it were a constant speed prop airplane and I was seeing 6 cylinders of digital indications, I would stand on the brakes, power comes into full, mixture gets leaned until the EGT peaks, and then you come in 50 degrees rich of peak EGT. Or 100 degrees rich, depending. Okay, and that's how the power is set. And you do that, everything looks good, you've got your abort point, you release the brakes, and almost nothing happens. That's basically how it goes. It's like, okay, we're gonna go flying now. And the plane starts going, and you're thinking to yourself, that can't be right. That isn't real. Like, something's wrong, you know? Or are we really gonna make this? And that's when it matters, because that's when you're happy you have your abort point. You start rolling down the runway, the airplane is picking up speed, picking up speed, picking up speed, and remember, you're literally making less power than you normally make. When the time comes to rotate the aircraft, you rotate, only it doesn't jump off the ground like it does in sea level. And I promise you that you do a thing that you don't know you do. And that is, if ever you lose directional control on takeoff, you wouldn't know it because you cover it by pulling the plane off the ground. That only became clear to me in Fort Bridger, Utah, as a young CFI, when my student went to rotate, and all that happened was, beep, right? The stall horn goes off. But as he's pulling it up to rotate, he's losing directional control and the airplane's going off the runway. So what does he do? He pulls harder. Beep, you know? That's it. The airplane's not going anywhere. But he never knew, and I never knew, that he had a directional control issue with the nose wheel up on takeoff, because at sea level here in Livermore, it's like the minute you pull back, you're airborne. San Carlos, the minute you pull back, you're airborne. It's not like that in a high density altitude. It's much more like a 747. You're rolling down the runway for a while with your nose wheel off the ground. How many of you have heard me talk about the Lindbergh reference? Okay. It was born in that moment at Fort Bridger, Utah. When the aircraft is going left and all we can see is blue sky, and it's like, holy cow, where is my student looking? I never even realized it was a problem at sea level. You're not there long enough to know it's a problem at sea level. So you have to have in your aircraft a good visual reference for what that looks like when the nose wheel's off the ground, but you're just rolling down the runway and you can't see anything in front of you. You're gonna stay there for 1,500 feet or so. So you have to have experienced that. You can practice for it. You know, you can do like high-speed taxis with your nose wheel off the ground and just see what it's like. But you'll get that experience if you come to a high-density altitude. In any case, and the density altitude that I'm describing, by the way, at Truckee or South Lake in the summertime is usually about 8,500 feet. But if you go down to Mammoth, it's closer to 10. So the last airport we hit in the weekend is Mammoth, where the density altitude is 10,000. And you know, what you'll feel as soon as the aircraft leaves the ground is the stall horn's on and you have to reduce your pitch. And when you reduce your pitch, it's possible that you settle back onto the runway. So you're kind of doing this little dance for a second where you're trying to reduce the pitch to gain the speed, but not so much that you touch back down on the ground. Okay? And all of this is happening at a very fast pace. You're taking off in a high density altitude. It's a performance value. It only matters in that critical moment during takeoff. Once we're clear of terrain, we've circle climbed up to altitude, we don't think about it so much anymore. We're dealing with other things like fuel burn or getting to your destination or whatever. Do you guys have any questions about high density altitude before I move on?
Turbo, it's a little different, right? You have turbo normalized or turbo?
Yeah, it's almost non-existent. So in a turbo, you're going to get sea level pressure returned to the intake, so you don't have any of that engine penalty. The only penalty you have is the prop blade, the wings, and so it'll feel a little different, but it's kind of a no-brainer. In fact, when people call to join our mountain trip and they say, I'd like to come, can I bring any airplane? Usually the only thing I say is don't bring a turbo. Like, it can be anything except a turbo. But if a turbo is what you fly and that's what you fly, then bring it. But I mean, we're going to kind of sleepwalk through the weekend. You know, you'll learn all about weather and contingency planning and survival skills, but you won't have an issue taking off.
Until you said that, he wasn't bringing any suitcases anytime we went to Mammoth, but we have a turbo. So.
You have a turbo, okay, yeah.
I'm like, no.
Yeah, I mean, it's something. You know, turbo presents maybe all sorts of other like potential risks, but yeah, not power on takeoff is not one of them. All right, let's talk a little bit about mountain meteorology. We're going to be pretty quick on this one. But with weather of any kind, we have certain no-goes that we decide ahead of time, right? Like, how many of you guys take off when the thunderstorms hit? Nobody does that, right? How many take off when you got a 50-knot crosswind? You don't do that, right? In the mountains, it's about wind at ridge level, typically. So if the winds at ridge level are 25 knots or more, we don't go. And you might say, well, 25 knots is not that big of a deal. I fly when there's 25 knots of wind. But you have to remember, there are a lot of effects that terrain, the orographic lifting you get from the shape of those rocks, there's a lot of effects it has when the wind starts moving through it. I always say to people, mountain flying is to flying what kayaking is to canoeing. Okay, that's a pretty good comparison. So you can go canoeing, and you're probably not going to hit class 5 rapids. But you up that ante to a kayak and you go out on a different experience, now anything's fair, right? Like you can encounter some pretty rough stuff and you can die out there doing it. Mountain flying's a little bit like that. And if you want to understand how the wind moves through the rocks, I call them rocks, but it's the mountains, right? Then you look at water. Air is a fluid, water is a fluid. And if you want to understand and visualize how the air is moving around the rocks, over the rocks, between the rocks, what's happening downstream, you just stare at a river with rocks in it for a while. The air is doing exactly the same thing. So if this podium is a rock or a mountain, and I'm the current, the water, or the air, and I hit it like this, I'm going to go up. So the current's moving this way, goes up on this side, it gets accelerated over the top, and then it's a downdraft on this side, and some distance downstream, maybe where Kurt is sitting, you'll get like a turbulent eddy, right? And you'll see that in the water. You'll see the water, if you're watching water, go over a rock, get accelerated over the top, come down, and then somewhere downstream you get a little turbulent eddy. And that's what we have to visualize when we're flying. We're trying to see where the wind is coming from in the mountains. We are trying to visualize the way that air is interacting with the rocks that it's flowing over. And we try to put the aircraft that we're flying in a position that is most advantageous to us. So, let me give you an example. Can I take this chair? Okay. Let's imagine that's a valley. Right over here is a valley. And the current is flowing this way. So the winds are moving this way. What kind of effect might we have on this side of the mountain here? Updraft, right? Good. All right, so the air hits this podium, it goes up, it gets accelerated over the top and shoots down right here, where it goes across the bottom of the valley and potentially comes up the other side, right? Okay, good. So, why would it be a bad idea to fly right down the middle of this valley? Lots of turbulent eddies, not a lot of options to turn around. I've heard arguments for both sides, but depending on how strong, so you definitely want to be on one side of the valley or the other when you're mountain flying. And I've heard arguments for being on both sides, so I know there's two opinions out there. But for me, it depends on the velocity of the wind. If the downdrafts were acceptable to me, I'd probably rather stay here in the downdraft side so that if I needed to, I was turning toward the updraft side. But some people would do the other. They would stay downstream. And again, it depends on the velocity of the winds. If the downdrafts are not acceptable, then you'd be on the other side, on the updraft side. The last place you ever want to be is in the middle of the valley. Okay, so all of these things are based on being able to visualize that very basic motion we were talking about of fluid over rocks. So if I had to, for example, cross this ridgeline, if this podium were a ridgeline and I wasn't going to go through the valley, but I was just going to cross the ridgeline, I would always do it at a 45-degree angle because I don't really know if I'm on the downdraft or updraft side, right? And if I'm on the downdraft side, which it turns out I am, and I start to get pushed down like the bonanza dentist from my story, I want to be on a 45-degree angle so that I can turn away from that terrain with something less than a 180-degree turn. Okay, so that makes sense. Okay, other things about mountain meteorology before we move on. I said we don't fly it when the winds are 25 knots at ridge level. That's partially due to the acceleration effect. So you should know that if the winds are reported at 25 knots at ridge level, they're likely more like 40 knots as they get accelerated over the top. And it's not that you can't handle maybe 40 knots of winds aloft, but remember this is kayaking. This is 40 knots going through rocks, getting launched up off rocks, creating eddies around the rocks. This isn't 40 knots in South Dakota or 40 knots at 9,000 feet with no terrain around. right? So that's where that rule of thumb comes from.
Jason,
Yeah.
where do you get ridgeline winds easiest? Where do you get that data? Will you repeat the question for that?
Yeah, so the question is, where do you get the data about winds at ridge level? And it's not as easy a question to answer as you might think, because you could say, well, if you're flying like a G1000 or a glass panel airplane, they'll give you the winds, right? But what you'll find if you're flying that plane is, as I approach the ridgeline, it'll say the winds are from here, then it'll say the winds are from here, then it'll say the winds are from here, right? So a lot of it is general knowledge of the way the air is moving, and then practicing these visualizations enough to know on a much more local level where you want to be and where you don't want to be. And that happens through practice. So like, I'll just give you an example. If I knew or if I suspected that the winds were doing what they're doing here, and this wasn't a chair, but it was like a bowl, like a granite bowl, like half dome or something, and it was totally severe, and I could see that as the wind went in there, it was going to go just shoot right up, I would avoid that thing at all costs. Right, so I wouldn't be going near that thing, and you're trying to just kind of read it as you go. Yeah, that's probably the best I can do there. Now, when the flow is really strong, like you get lenticular clouds, it's obvious. So when the winds are stronger than 25 knots at ridge level on some days, depending on what's happening in the higher levels of the atmosphere, you can get those lenticular clouds that look sort of like spaceships. Those are days that you don't want to fly unless you're a glider pilot.
Is there like a set altitude? You say coming in at 45, what would be your minimum terrain clearance over that ridge? So 500 feet, 1,000 feet, higher is better? Or?
Yeah, I mean, higher is better if you are, depending on how much fun you want to have. You know what I mean? Like if you're just going from here to Salt Lake City, get as much altitude as you can on those mountains and go. But if you're enjoying the experience and having fun, and you know, like sometimes like a really fun teaching moment on these trips is when we take off out of Alpine County and the winds are just right so that we can go into Luther Valley, like way below ridge level, 3,000 feet below ridge level, and just get shot up like an elevator in the updraft. You know, and then you can experience that and see it. And some people enjoy that. Like I have a good friend, Justin Phillipson. Does anyone know Justin? Anyway, he flies a 120. And he loves going out in the Sierras in his 120. I mean, he flies a Gulfstream professionally, but he has a 120, and his fun is to go out there and play in those currents, like a kayaker would go play in those currents, you know. So normally, mountain clearance is 2,000 feet above terrain. What we're talking about here is different than that a little bit. But it's important to have those no-goes. Like I said, 25 knots at ridge level, we're not going, right? If there's thunderstorms building up off the ridges, that orographic lifting, we're not going. If there's lenticular clouds, we're not going. Fog or other reduced visibility, we're not going. And you will never see me flying over the mountains at night. IFR or VFR. All right, let's talk about contingency planning, because this is sort of, does anyone have questions about meteorology that we didn't get to? There's probably a lot. Okay. Yep.
I was just going to say, when I go up to Tahoe, I'm always looking at the prog charts to see what the pressure gradients are.
Nice.
When you see those lines close together, you know it's going to be blazing perpendicular.
Yep. Yeah, and you know, I mean, we can talk a little bit about, I don't want to like get too macabre in all this, but like there is a normalization of deviance, and I had a real tough experience. Gosh, time is funny for me. 7 years ago? I don't know. Anyway, my friend Mario Felice, his dad died up there in an in-flight breakup. Did anybody know the Felice family? They're a flying family their whole life, and that was what was so tough about it, is that his dad was going into Minden in a twin. I don't remember what kind of twin they had, and they had an in-flight breakup. The tail came off. And that particular day, I was in Palm Springs with my family, and I remember thinking, before I heard about this accident at all, I remember thinking, I can't believe how windy it is. We were going to go hiking on the ground with our feet, but we couldn't go because it was like getting sandblasted in your face. Like you couldn't be outside. The winds were 40 knots, 45 knots, I don't know what it was. So when I heard that Mario's dad was returning the airplane through the Owens Valley, you know, from the Bay Area to Minden on this particular day, it made sense. It's like, oh, okay, so that was severe turbulence. The more interesting thing to think about is how many times had he done that successfully in his life, and it was no big deal. Dozens and dozens, if not hundreds and hundreds. So it's really important when you learn to fly in the mountains that you take the idea of personal minimums and go, no-go decisions, and you just codify it so that it, can't be changed. You've thought it through ahead of time, and you are just not going to go when the winds are that strong. All right, contingency planning. How many people fly with a PLB? It's pretty good. You guys know what a PLB is? Personal locator beacon. If you were to come on our trip, the mountain trip that we do, my partner Howard Donner is a rescue doctor. He's been on over 200 mountain rescues, and he talks about all the different PLB technologies, what's superior about some, what's inferior about others, which ones you should get, right down to the idea that some of them are, you buy them once and you own them, others are subscriptions. So for somebody like Howard who's traveling around the world, like right now he's in, Turkey. He's traveling around the world all the time. For him, it's easy to miss a credit card bill or a credit card statement or something. So he doesn't have a Spot or a Garmin because he doesn't want to miss the bill and not get rescued, right? So like these kinds of considerations. How many people file flight plans when they fly? Is that a thing even? Yes. Okay, excellent. So you guys heard that stat that I laid out about flight plans, and it's true. If you have a flight plan, you are much more likely to be found and to be found sooner. There's a long list of reasons that is true, but here's where I've ended up with flight plans. I think it's unrealistic to ask everybody to file a VFR flight plan every time you fly. You're certainly not going to file one if you're flying from Livermore to Concord, right? Not even Livermore to where I'm headed, Auburn later. I'm flying right over the Central Valley. There's no radar obstructions. I'm going to be on NorCal with flight following, and if I have any issues, I'll just tell them, Mayday, 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 I'm already talking, right? That doesn't work in the mountains. So the first thing you're going to hear when you get into high terrain, radar contact lost, frequency change approved. Squawk 1200, frequency change approved. So if flight following was your backup plan, you're going to lose it. That's no backup plan. But here's what's true. Often you don't know you need a flight plan until you look out the window, right? For those of us that have been flying for a long time, you don't file the flight plan before you go, you take off, you look out the window and you think, man, if I had an issue here, I'd be hosed, right? This would be a real problem. I should probably have a flight plan. That's how that goes often. So the skill that we practice on our trip is the ability to conjure a flight plan out of thin air on a VHF radio. So in that moment when you look out the window and you say, I really should have a flight plan for if I'm going to be flying here, I want you to be able to find a flight service station frequency, call flight service, and tell them you want to file and activate a VFR flight plan right now. I heard some wows in there, like that's a crazy skill to contemplate, man. That's insanity. Yeah, it's a real thing. And it's still there for us, right? And I had this funny experience coming back. We used to do an island trip before COVID in the San Juan Islands, and we were coming back from that trip one year, and we were flying as a loose formation. We had like 4 planes all together. And the lead plane had a flight plan, and we deviated. Someone said, hey, can we fly closer to the coast? And I said, sure, let's go closer to the coast. And then I just called the lead plane. I was like, hey, will you guys update the route on the flight plan? Because why would you have a flight plan? What's the point of a flight plan? Search and rescue, so they know where you are, right? So if you file a flight plan and you say, I'm going to go directly from here to White Flowers, but then you go over here, what was the point of having the flight plan? It doesn't make any sense at all, right? So if you get comfortable calling flight service on the radio, then it's no problem to just say, okay, I'll tell flight service, hey, we're going to deviate 10 miles east to check something out, and then we're going to pick up our old course again. Okay, fine. Now they know if you go down. So I contact the lead plane and I say, it's all CFIs now, no clients. It's just all CFIs flying home. And this young CFI was in the lead plane, and I said, hey, will you modify our route as we're going to go closer to the coast? He goes, sure. 10 minutes later, he comes back and he goes, I can't do it. And I was like, why? He's like, because I don't have any cell coverage. Honest to God, he was trying to edit that in ForeFlight, man. Just trying to get that thing edited in ForeFlight, and he couldn't do it. He had only one bar. Only one bar. What are his options? Pinned against the wall, you know? I was like, come on, man. It's 122.2, right? Or whatever the frequency is, and they're all over the chart. And some people say, well, hey, sometimes that's really confusing. Like it has a 1221 with an R behind it, and I don't know then I don't know what I have to do. And it's like, come on, the R means they only receive it, and you listen over the nav radio. That's it. It's not that complicated. If there's an R there, that means they only receive on the top frequency, and you have to listen over the VOR. So that's a little bit complicated. But the bottom line is, if you contact flight service in flight and tell them you want to file and activate a flight plan right now, even if they sound annoyed about it, even if they sound upset about it, it doesn't matter. They're on the clock, and I promise flight service does not have enough to do right now. So they're on the clock. They don't have enough to do. I even ask them to read me the form. What's more, I don't have a form with me. Can you prompt me through that? Get them to work for you. If you want that flight plan for search and rescue, get that flight plan. With one tip that I'm going to give you right now. Don't tell them the real route. Okay, because if you say to them, my route is, podium to white flowers to half-empty beer, and half-empty beer to the camera over there, they're going to say, I need a lat long for all those waypoints, right? That's what they're going to tell you. So instead, what you should say to them is, I'm going to go direct from podium to camera. But in the remarks, I want you to write that I actually flew to white flowers, then to half-empty beer, then to camera. In the remarks. And they're free in the remarks to write whatever they want. So you don't have to give them the lat long. Just skip that whole thing. If you do all the lat longs, you're going to come find me and hurt me. You're going to say, that was a bad experience, Jason. I tried it, and it's awful. I'm never doing it again. So don't do that. But if you tell them you're going direct and you just give them the route in the remarks, it's on file, it's there. The last thing about flight plans that some people say is they say, well, I don't want to do it because, what if I land and I forget to close it? Does anybody have that fear? Like I forget to close it? All right. Here's my strategy for that one. And I honestly, before I even do that, just a small soapbox thing is like, I wouldn't worry about it, about forgetting to close it. Don't worry too much about it. I've been flying since 1997. I've never heard of a search being launched, literally launched, because someone forgot to close their flight plan. They'll look for you. They'll call the sheriff. They'll call the local airport. They might even ask the sheriff to drive out and see if your plane is parked in its spot, but they're not going to launch search and rescue, right? That's one thought. The second thought is, if you go down in a meadow, what's 2 hours? It's not a big deal, hopefully. 2 days is a big deal if you didn't file the flight plan. So I would lie about my time en route. If you think it's going to take you an hour, tell them it's going to take you 2. Who cares, right? That way you can land at your destination, you can tie the airplane down, you can go into the FBO, you can pay your thing, you can get your Uber, you can go to the bar and say, oh, my flight plan, and you're still within the window. All right, so don't let any of those things stop you. The idea is you're going to have that flight plan filed because that is going to be the initiation of the search process if you need to. And everything from there, staying found, is about how to get those rescuers closer and closer to you. So how many people have a survival kit in their airplane? What kind of things are in that kit, do you know? Have you ever looked at it? What's in there? Like iodine for water, a little silver space blanket. Signal mirror, there's good. You guys know how to use those. Yeah, fishing equipment, right, stuff like that. So most survival kits, my point is, most of them have stuff that you absolutely don't need. No, I'm not even, it's just what's true. There's a rule of threes in survival, right? You can go 3 weeks without food, 3 days without water, 3 minutes without air. And as my partner Howard, who does all of this survival lecturing on our actual trips, likes to say, 3 seconds following a stupid decision. But if you can go 3 weeks without food, and you can go 3 days without water, what good is that fishing hook doing you? Right, you got 3 weeks, you're not gonna be out there for 3 weeks. We're gonna have you out there for 24 to 36 hours. You need to survive 1 night. And you need to stay strong enough so that when that flight plan and your PLB, which you activated as you had this forced landing, as all that stuff percolates out into the universe and everybody starts to come and look for you, that as they get closer and closer and closer, they can find you. So when you come on our trip, you get your own Finer Points survival kit. But I was just going to show you a couple of the things that we would put in a survival kit with the idea in mind that you want to only be there for one night. The first thing is shelter. This might not look like a lot of shelter. It's just a big, heavy-duty garbage bag, right? That's all it is. Let me see if I might need the mic stand for this one. However, if you cut a hole, don't do that thing where you stick your head out the top like you're going to a football game, right? Don't do that. But if you just take the corner right here, just this corner, and cut a little slit right there for your face, and then put this garbage bag over your head so that your head's covered in plastic and only your face is sticking out. And you can get over next to a tree, even if it's raining, and get this whole garbage bag over your body and get down low, right? You're totally dry, you're protected. That might be shelter for 24 hours. As you hear those rescuers get closer and closer and closer to you, you're going to be exhausted from probably yelling. You need a way to get them to come see you or hear you. And somebody mentioned a signal mirror. There's absolutely nothing better than a signal mirror for that final moment of rescue. So one of the videos on my YouTube channel is me flying with the Civil Air Patrol, and they took me to their practice area in Chicago where they have an airplane crashed on the ground already, and they told me where it was. They said, there's an airplane crashed in the southeast corner of this field. Let us know when you see it. I didn't see it. And they said, how can you not see that? It's a twin-engine airplane. It's a Beech 18. You can't see a Beech 18 crashed in the southeast corner of this field? I couldn't see it. So we kept flying their search pattern, and eventually I saw the airplane. But you can only imagine, that was a field in Illinois. There was a Citabria that crashed in the Bay Area in the early 90s in the East Bay Hills, and it took them 3 days to find it, right? In between Walnut Creek and Oakland. 3 days. So it's not easy to find an airplane.
Look at Fawcett.
Yeah, Steve Fawcett, same thing. Of course, no one knew where he was because he didn't file a flight plan.
Whoopsie.
Whoops. But he had a PLB on his watch, though. It didn't go so good for him. Anyway, this is a professional signal mirror, and one of the things that we do, we call these trips airplane camp because one year a 6-year-old came out and in about 3 seconds said, oh, I get it, it's airplane camp for adults. I said, yeah, that's it, actually, kid, you're right. So he sees a bunch of adults out there doing signal mirrors, you know. But we get half the group flying in the pattern and half the group on the ground after you learn how to signal so that you can get in the pine trees and signal the planes in the pattern. And then we switch. And once you learn how to hit something with a signal mirror, it's impressive. It's like an explosion of light. You cannot miss it. There's no laser flare I've ever seen. There's no technology I've ever seen. There is nothing as good as a signal mirror on a sunny day. It's blinding. You can't miss it. So that tells the rescuers, yes, in fact, you're here. They land. They try to home in on you. You got this whistle so that they can find you. Things like that, very practical things that we can teach you to survive 24 to 36 hours out there so that you can go home to your family. I pretty much just condensed the entire 4-day weekend into 40 minutes. So hopefully that wasn't too frenetic for you guys. But hey, if you want the full experience, there are still spots available for anybody who would like to join us. It's June 20, 21st, 22nd, and 23rd. We're at South Lake Tahoe this year. And that is our trip. I'll take questions from you guys if you have any. Yep.
Just the first time I landed up at Tahoe, the first thing I noticed was indicated airspeed versus my actual ground speed.
Right. Yeah.
Most people, first time if they're going by visual, they're gonna land hard.
Yeah, 100%. You know, and sometimes I've even had lay people say things like that to me. I don't know, this is my wife or somebody would say to me like, you know, I landed in Vegas. I was flying Southwest. Man, it seemed like we were screaming in there. I was like, well, you were, kind of, you know? You're going a lot faster than you were when you landed in Chicago in the winter, you know? It's a whole different thing. The air is thinner. The plane has to go faster through the air to get that same speed. And what the gentleman was pointing out is the higher you go in the atmosphere, the more divergent your indicated airspeed is from your true airspeed. There's a great rule of thumb, and then I'll call on you. Sorry, there's a great rule of thumb, though. It's 2% of your indicated for every 1,000 feet up is what you add back. So Let's say you're indicating 100 knots at 10,000 feet, then your true airspeed's 120. Did I do that right? 2% for every 1,000. Did I do the math right on that? Okay. Right, so, but it's 2% for every 1,000 feet added back to your indicated will be the difference between your indicated and your true. Yep.
All right, so you're mentioning something about that safety mirror, right?
The signal mirror, yeah.
All you just do is hold it up to the sun and then...
It's not quite that easy. It's not quite that easy. Like, if you can see it, you can pass this back there too. Here's a, Anyway, it's got this little sighting system. Can I give this to you real quick, Robin? Sorry. It's got like a sighting system that gives you a virtual sun. What you're talking about it's not intuitive like you're saying. Like, you have to make sure that the angle is right. It might look right to you, but you're not hitting your intended target. So,
Otherwise they'd be like, ooh, I'm blind.
no, you just wouldn't hit them. You just wouldn't hit them at all. So you'd be sitting there doing your little flicky thing and no one would see you. But if you can learn how to manipulate the signal mirror such that you have that little virtual sun in the sighting window, then anywhere you put that sight will be the thing that you're hitting. Yep.
Do you find any value in actually practicing low power takeoffs at sea level to simulate?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. In fact, my mentor, Richard, who was kind of a tough dude, he used to say to me, I could do a whole mountain checkout in the Bay Area using what was that mountain that has Angwin on it up there by Sonoma? Yeah. He's like, I could use that mountain, Mount Diablo, and partial power takeoffs and teach you everything you need to know. So the gentleman's point is, if you lose power at a high density altitude, so if I'm taking off at Truckee and full throttle only gives me 40% power, then why can't I simulate that at Livermore by only setting 40% power? Instead of going full power on takeoff, I'll set 1,700 RPM. You can, and I have, and I do. And you have to use caution, make sure at the right airport, you have options, there's runway in front of you if you have an actual incident, you're not pushing it, right, that kind of thing, but yeah. It's the same, and if you can get close to Mount Diablo on windy days, like Richard was talking about, it's the same. Maybe not quite as good, but darn close.
You missed the same picture of going real fast over vision.
Yeah, you do, and it's not it's not quite the same. You can get people ready for it, you can prepare for it, you can get introduced to it. Anybody else have a question? Somebody else? Oh yeah, yes sir.
A bucket list flight is the flight over Yosemite Valley.
Yeah.
Mountain one.
Yeah.
Do you have a good source for that plan?
Well, the problem with Yosemite Valley is that it's a national park. So you really have to stay 2,000 feet above the highest peak. Like, it's pretty, but at that altitude, there's not a whole lot of mountain flying. It's like flying over the mountains, you know. Some people want to cross that off their bucket list, like they want to cross off the Grand Canyon on the Canyon Strip, and I get that. But the real fun is not in the parks. It's when you can get low to terrain, when you can fly into mountain passes where, maybe you're not sure if you can clear it or not, and you have to employ some of the stuff you've learned.
Yeah. 2 questions about the flight plan.
Sure.
I am embarrassed to say I forget. Is a phone number listed on the flight plan? If you're afraid of forgetting to close it, can you expect to get a phone call like you do with?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, they'll call you. Yeah, and there's all sorts of ways to text that you're closing it now. Like there's really what anybody who's serious about adding this contingency planning to their repertoire should go to 1-800-WX-BRIEF.com and create an account. That's going to be the easiest thing. It's going to make contacting them so much easier. You give them your name or your phone number, they look up your account, especially if you're a private owner. If you're a private owner, you can put an airplane on file so that when I give them my cell phone number, they go, oh, Jason, hi, you flying the 150 today? Okay, good. How long are you going and where are you going? Which route are you taking and how much fuel do you have and who's on board? It's real easy. So you can make all that very easy for yourself. Yes?
So many years ago, I did a VFR with an instructor who tried to teach me a canyon turn.
Oh, yeah.
And he described it. The way that he had you do it was basically put in, I think it was 2 notches of flaps, and pitched up almost till the airplane was about to stall,
Yeah.
and then, kick the rudder and the aileron and come back down and release the flaps. Do you recommend that as a technique? Do you teach anything like it in your courses?
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, that's a real emergency maneuver.
Pretty extreme.
Yeah, if you need.
Trying to scare Nick, who's in the back seat.
Well, it's such a complicated thing. I actually did a YouTube video on the canyon turn, and it's like one of the YouTube videos that I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and think I should replace that. Because what I showed in that video is what you described. It just takes a very specific. To be fair, I wasn't talking about it in terms of canyons. I was talking about Corey Lidle. Do you guys remember that Yankees pitcher that hit the building? And my point was, if you need a minimum radius turn, you can do what you're talking about. And as long as you're not afraid and you've practiced it, it would be a minimum radius turn. But if I was in a canyon like this, at a high density altitude, where my airplane was not quite at its best performance, you'd probably be better off just slowing to minimum controllable airspeed and just making a tight little turn at the slowest speed possible, right? But those are two really different situations. I think when it comes to canyon turns, and this is why I'd want to redo that YouTube video, there's really 3 tricks you should have up your sleeve depending on what you need. Anybody else have a question? Yeah.
So flying, you mentioned mountain flying, you have to cross the Sierra. I was flying to Southern California.
Yeah.
You still have to go, if you fly from Livermore, crossing the Pass.
Yeah. That's great flying there.
The first time I did it, it's like I was looking at altitudes on the chart, and you get there and suddenly you see that the pass itself, it's like 2,000 feet below or maybe more, below the peaks.
Yeah.
And you get hit with winds over and so on. So, that was, first time doing it.
Right.
How do you recommend to avoid those situations when you get into those?
Yeah, it's tough to how do you avoid that? I think what you're doing here, being at this lecture, but that's why we run these courses. For every person that came up to me and said, I think you guys saved my life, it's like, yes, another person that we might have got to before they did something that was over their head, if you don't know how to visualize the wind and you don't know what you're looking for, there's not much you can do. You're just sort of flying into it, hoping you don't hit terrain, Yeah.
Is there, do you get many experimentals in your courses?
We haven't had many, to be honest. Yeah. I'm trying to think back. There have been a few, but not many. And there's no particular reason for that. We have, we've got all the instructors. One of our guys, Peter Lurt, used to write for EAA, sport pilot. He's a builder. He's we certainly have the CFIs we could put in there. We just haven't had the requests. Yep. Did I miss somebody? Yeah.
Yes, sir. I do recommend a high altitude takeoff technique to stay in ground effect for a distance, and then accelerated ground effect, and then climb out at high altitude.
No, I don't recommend it. And then, we could probably have a beer and talk about it. If you were somebody that was, dead set that was better than the other way, I'd be ears to hear it. But no, typically once you have, in the mountains, indicated speed is the same as it is anywhere. That's the good news is the one thing that never changes is your indicated air speeds. If 74 is your best rate of climb, 74 is your best rate of climb. So typically I'm more focused on getting the aircraft out of ground effect and finding those climb speeds and then just climbing away. I would be nervous to keep it low, especially if there's rising terrain all the way around, under the idea that somehow I can gain altitude or get more altitude than I would have if I would have just climbed out at VY. But to be fair, I don't have a ton of experience experimenting with that either. So, that'd be a fun one to talk through or try. Some of this stuff you can go try and say, hey, what works better for me? Some people ask the question, when you come into land, how do you know where to set your mixture for a potential go-around? And honestly, the answer is no one does. That's the honest answer. If you can remember where it was on takeoff, put a little mark on it, because that's where it's going to be on landing, assuming you weren't gone that long. But what we do is we kind of guess at it a little bit, and sometimes, this is what made me think of it, sometimes we go down and try it. Let me go do a go-around. My first pass is going to be an intentional go-around so I can see, do I have my power set right? Is my mixture right? Am I going to be able to get out of here if I take it further into the flare, you know? And so there's nothing wrong in a safe way with experimenting, see how your plane works and see what you like best. But, yeah. Yes, sir?
Here's more of a fun question.
Yeah.
How many people have flown into Leadville, Colorado?
Leadville.
I've been to Leadville, and what's the other one in Colorado? It's Telluride.
Telluride, oh yeah. Boy. It's like every time you mention one of those airports, I have a story. But my Leadville story is actually a good young CFI story. I went out as a young CFI on a mountain trip that I didn't run. I was hired at some school out of Palo Alto. And I was pretty young. And there was all these old timers there. And I noticed they weren't doing the short field takeoff procedure, which I had equated with a critical climb procedure. Like I had equated in my mind high performance climb with short field takeoff. Has anyone else done that? Right? I disconnected it that day. Because here we are at Leadville, the density altitude was close to 13,000 feet, right? Leadville, just on any day, is what, 10,000 feet above sea level? It's the highest airport in the US. And I'm going off with my 182, by the book, short field takeoff, 20 degrees of flaps. I wasn't even getting out of ground effect. I mean, it was anemic. And I just, couldn't figure out what was wrong. I was doing the maximum performance takeoff, and I got to lunch, and I asked one of the old-time instructors, I'm like, what am I doing wrong? I'm doing this maximum. He goes, it's not a short field. I said, Leadville's huge. So I realized short field takeoff procedure is designed to get you off of a short strip of pavement, and it says nothing about your climb ability. So there's usually a penalty for climbing with flaps. So if you can take off with the aircraft in a clean configuration, you should. And being that Leadville was about 75 miles long, I could take off. I could take off with the flaps up, and that's what I should have been doing. So that's the Leadville story.
How much runway did you use?
It wasn't the runway. Like we got off the run. Oh, you mean with the flaps up? I don't remember. It's plenty long though. Leadville's huge. Yeah. Well, the runway length wasn't the issue. The Telluride story, not even sure if there's any learning to share with that one. I guess as long as we're being forthcoming. My partner, Howard, who I've talked about many times here tonight, my partner in these airplane camp trips is what I mean. He's a medical doctor, expedition physician, brilliant teacher, and we sort of run these trips or design these trips together. He lived in Telluride. He was a doctor there. It's where he did over 200 mountain rescues. And I remember we were going in on a trip to Telluride, and I called Howard, and I said, what can you tell me? Because we're bringing 4 airplanes there tomorrow, and I want to know. And he said, well, if the winds are out of the southwest, don't come here. Basically, that's what I'm going to tell you. And then the last thing he said is, do you need us?
I just want to say last call for food is going to be at 8:30 in about 15 minutes, okay?
Oh my gosh, and I really have to go because of the TFR. But I'll finish the story quickly. Howard said, don't come if the winds are out southwest, but if you have any problems at Telluride, the good news is at the end of the runway there's a big cliff and it goes down to the Colorado River and you can follow it all the way to Mexico. And I said, okay, great. I got my backup plan, right? Little did I know I was going to have to use that backup plan. So we went into Telluride that day, and the mistake I think is that everything takes longer than you think, right? Like here's 8:15 and I have to go. But on this day, we went into breakfast at 10 o'clock. By the time we got all the people there, and we're taking off at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Right? What's the hottest part of the day? 2 o'clock in the afternoon. My student wasn't very comfortable. She was having trouble. When she rotated the plane, we did that 747 thing, the stall horn screaming, the plane lifts off, and then it touches back down. Then it lifts off again, and then it touches back down. And I had one of those pucker moments as a CFI where I said, holy cow, we're not going to make this. So I took control of the airplane, and on the last bounce, I just made sure it hit real hard, and we bounced over the airplane, over the fence, and out toward the Colorado River. And that was, I learned a lot at Telluride that day about density altitude, and about how if it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and the density altitude is 13,000 feet, and you effed up because you went to breakfast for too long, it's time to go relax and take off later, or go tomorrow, or not push it. So. Anyway, I tell you these stories not because I'm proud, but because I'm human, and I want you to know that that's how that goes sometimes. Thank you guys all so much for inviting me here. I really enjoyed it. I appreciate it. Thanks, Robin.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to have him get a picture of us.